He is day zero NASA. He was recruited from Navy JPL back in like the 50s. And he brought some of his collection of things he's gathered over his life. Most notable accomplishments are inventing the TDRS satellite, which, if you do anything regarding space, every satellite talks to TDRS to talk to the rest of the satellites and the rest of the world. So, pretty much the most important satellites. And yeah, we have cool stuff. Here's that.
He keeps saying you have to have a speech to start this off with. I really would like to do this very extemporaneously. It all started, he lives in my neighborhood, I live in his neighborhood, and he comes down around a lot of times. And they discovered this junk that I've acquired over the years, and they said that guys like you would be very interested in what they are and where they came from and so forth. So I'm going to try to cover it that way by telling you really my life's work, okay? I graduated from college at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. Couldn't find a job. It was a Depression year. So I worked for Montgomery Ward repairing radios, refrigerators, washing machines. I got good at that for about 9 months. And then came back to look for a job to Washington, D.C., and by luck, an opening happened at the Naval Research Lab, and this is 1950. I want you to know I'm 91 years old. Okay. So 1950, I got the job in April. It was shooting rockets in New Mexico, shooting up rockets. And the only thing I could come up with, and I'd say, and they pay me too. It's really unbelievable job. So that rocket was called the Viking rocket, and there's a picture of it in here. But the first rocket that was used was built in Germany. It was called the V2. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. It was used by the Germans and bombed England, many of them. Well, when the war ended in 1945-46, the U.S. captured 150 of those things and brought them to the U.S., and they started a program. This is about 1945. They started a program of measuring what happens in the atmosphere. Nobody had been above 30 miles. Balloons, that was their maximum level. So a rocket would take you up higher than that. So a group of scientists formed together, and they produced a upper atmosphere research panel, and that's where the first research began in space, using first the V2 rocket, and then later the Naval Research people sent one of their men to Caltech. He learned how to build rockets, came back 2 years later, gave a contract to Glenn L. Martin, which today is known as Martin Marietta and Martin and Lincoln, to build a rocket called the Viking. A little bit of technology. The V2 has fins that protrude out. And if you go to the Air and Space Museum, you can see a V2 there. And pay attention to the big fins on the side. That was required to kind of steer the thing while it was rising in the atmosphere. They didn't need it later. To steer it, they used 2 carbon vanes, east and west and north and south. And as they tilt them, that would deflect some of the flame, and that would tilt the rocket so they could steer it with those vanes. The same thing as you do in a boat. The Viking introduced a new method called gimbaled motor. So the engine itself was in a set of 2 rings where they could tilt it that way or the other way. And that proved to be very successful. Initial Viking had huge fins. And they said, well, let's see if we don't need them. The next launch, they'd cut them down, and then finally they got rid of them altogether. And today when you see a rocket take off, it's thin, slender thing, no fins. And they use this little guy as a jet engine that would use it after they've run out of fuel to steady the rocket, okay? So I don't see Kevin here, but Kevin Lynn looked at that and says,
Currently in
oh.
space. You can hear him.
Excellent. So
He's here in spirit.
I said peroxide. It has to be pure peroxide. You feed it in through here. There's a mess of magnesium in here. And so peroxide, when it sees some other material, it changes into steam, and you get steam out of that. So that's one of the steering jets that came off of a Viking rocket. Okay. What intrigued them was this guy. What was that? Well, who's been in the Air and Space Museum? A bunch of you. And there's a pit in there with a bunch of rockets in it. Okay? Anybody remember that? Yeah?
Yeah.
I worked on all those rockets. Okay?
All of those rockets. That's crazy.
And the first one was a Viking rocket, and the very top tip of it, if you pay attention, has this point on it. This is one that was flown in White Sands, New Mexico, and the white stuff you see on there, white sand is a name given for gypsum. It's the stuff you make plaster out of. And so this is the gypsum that after the Viking takes off, goes up over 100 miles high. Do I need this?
Huh? We are recording. We record it. We use it for the
recording
stream.
Okay. And so when it's starting down, they've done tests. If you leave it assembled as it is and it hits the ground, it just dissipates. So we break it apart as it starts coming down when it's about 40 miles high. We fire some primer cord and break it up into pieces. And so it flutters down. And as I understand it, someone falling has a limit of about 200 miles an hour. So this came down, crashed. I'm in charge of the recovery party afterward. There are experiments we've flown in the nose, and we have to go and recover things from that. And this one was the tip. It had maybe a temperature measurement inside of it. So that's my museum piece. The other part that we fly in there is this guy. This is called a gun camera. And anybody wants to handle it, you're happy to. It's put on. It was used in World War II in fighter planes. It has a cassette where you put a 16mm roll of film in here, and it's installed in the wing. And when the pilot shoots his gun, this gets turned on to record his shot. And so if he claims I shot down an enemy plane, he has to prove it with the film. Well, we used this to put in the Viking rocket, and in one particular one, about 1954, there were two of these in there. One had color film, and one had black and white film. And by accident, the Viking rocket misbehaved, and it did a kind of a spin, but a very slow spin, and it precessed like a top, and as it did, it would do a turn and then be tip, a turn, and did a spiral thing. So when we took the film out and had it developed, we had to go out there and recover the camera. The camera is installed in another steel box so that it comes back kind of together. A fellow by the name of Otto Berg, he's passed away now recently, but he spent 3 months and he pieced that 16mm pieces of film together, and lo and behold, he had the first picture of a hurricane. Nobody had seen a hurricane in its form and the hole in the middle and everything. And this was one of the giant ones that we'd gotten. It was over Mexico in half U.S., half Mexico. I've looked everywhere for that picture. It was so important that Life magazine, anybody heard of Life magazine? Life magazine made a centerfold of that picture. It's about that big. And I would love to show it to you. We have some pictures. Okay. These were taken by other kinds of camera. It's called a K12 camera. It uses 50 millimeter size film. And this is one of them that I'm the guy that put the camera in. I'm responsible for the cameras as part of my job. I'm the guy that took these pictures. This is the first picture where you can barely see the curvature of the Earth. Okay? So we proved it was round. And he's got some others in there, but those pictures, you can rummage through them.
These are originals too, right?
Those are the originals. The camera, I ran into security, your friend over there.
My husband.
Your husband?
Yeah.
And he's told me about that. Kodak makes that camera, the K12, and that K12 camera was the one we used for this. It has an infrared filter so that we can finally see through the clouds. Okay, so you can actually, that starts from New Mexico all the way to California, and the Pacific Ocean is the black area. Yeah. So I've actually taken, I think, this one and identified a railroad track, and it was 1,000 miles long. I followed that track in there, so the quality of that is excellent back in those. So those are some of the first pictures. A couple of our scientists at Naval Research Lab have written reports on those pictures.
What year were those taken?
Say again?
What year were those taken?
1954. Okay, was when the pictures, before that, I started in 1950, so I'm not sure of the date, but it's before 54. And 54 was the date when we had that accident and got the picture of the hurricane. That picture then triggered that, hey, we can tell the weather using a rocket and later on satellites. And you guys, we all benefit from that today, that technology. You want to say something? So, okay, all right.
Oops to success.
So that was my early part of the career. I was the payload manager, so to speak, for a number of years. And then that has a picture of the V2 rocket.
Sorry, V2.
We said there were so few of us that we used the V2 for the same purposes. We named ourselves pioneers with V2. Okay, so I'm claiming I'm a pioneer using those rockets.
Work for it over there and here.
Yeah. So in 1955, the world decided it ought to study the Earth. And the U.S. proposed, I'm shortening all this, the U.S. proposed to put a satellite up, which later we called the Vanguard. And I remember that name was chosen by a group of us still sitting in the conference room. The Russians, that note, you got the other white board in there?
This one?
Yeah, his mother,
This one or the other one?
Scribble's mother, not yet, okay, I'll come back. Scribble's mother put that together for me last night, which you should read because it tells you the beginning of the Viking and the beginning of the Vanguard program, how it started, and there's a picture of a Viking rocket in there. That's where he learned his stuff from his mother. Remember that. So in 55, we decided to invent satellites. And we worked on a sphere about that large. And the earliest technology, how do you control the temperature of the thing. Back then, it had to do with the reflective coating. And so you try to design something that there's a balance between absorption and reflection. And our mechanical engineers were great at that. So that's made it a very shiny satellite. And the temperature we calculated would be in the 70-degree range when we launch it. So we started out, the Viking is a single-stage rocket, and our mathematicians and very famous people. I took vector analysis from their winner's name. The PhD, Newell, Dr. Newell. He had a nickname at Maryland University called Cruel Newell. He was tough as a Dickens in teaching you math. But I learned vector from him, vector analysis. And that came in handy in a number of things that I got involved in.
Ed,
Yeah.
speaking of Vanguard, do you want to talk about the story about the satellite that's in the Air and Space Museum? The dinged up one?
Well, I'm going to get the, yeah.
Okay.
So the first, the Vanguard program had finally decided that a 3-stage rocket is what was needed. So the Viking became the first stage, the Araby was the second stage, and a solids propellant was the third stage. And when you run a program like that, you first launch the first stage with dummies of the others to see if that's going to work. And then you pair the two and you see if that's going to work. And the first 3 was going to be tested. And somebody said, what if you succeeded? So there was a lot of electronics in there. We got it in there, still in the test stage. So this is Roger Easton and an associate of his. And he came up with the idea of what I call the grapefruit. So if you go in the Smithsonian, you'll see hanging on the wire a small satellite about that big with some antennas sticking out of it, okay? So that was called the first Vanguard satellite. I called it the grapefruit satellite. All it had was a transmitter in it. And then somebody at Fort Monmouth in the Army came up to visit us and they said, how'd you like to put some solar panels on that? Can you believe that? The first solar panels, they were about that big. And Roger said, yeah, great. He put a second transmitter on that ran from the solar panels. And we called that an experiment. We could measure the temperature on the skin and the temperature inside, and would broadcast all of that. Well, the first test launch came right soon after the Russians launched Sputnik, which made them first in the world to get it up there. Now, they used their missile. And in the U.S., Eisenhower was the president, and he didn't want the satellite program to be a military attachment, because then people could say, your satellite is flying over my territory, I'm going to shoot it down. So we're kind of lucky in that the Russians went up first and nobody wanted to shoot it down. Okay? And so today, space up there is accepted as belonging to everybody. And so I thought it was a great name. That's why NRL was chosen, because it was a civilian organization that operated Naval Research Lab. Well, soon after the Viking, Sputnik went up, we were going to have our launch, and I think it was in November. And the rocket rose about 10 feet, and suddenly something exploded, and it came down on national TV. This huge thing topples over. There's a video of it. It topples over, and the nose of the third stage opens up, and out comes the ball. The guy who built it runs and grabs it and took it home. And that is now the one hanging in the Smithsonian.
It's in his closet for what, like 30 years or something? And the Smithsonian was like, wait, do you still have it? And he's like, Yeah?
That's about right. So it was stored away in the Smithsonian. So at the 50th anniversary, someone said, "Have you ever opened it?" And they never opened it. So we had this little ceremony on the top floors of the Smithsonian where they carefully, with white gloves and everything else, they opened the thing up. And it was complete and serene in there. It had NiCad batteries. They hadn't wasted away or anything. Everything was hunky-dory in that thing. 50 years later. We later succeeded in well, then came the one. You want to hold it up? Then the second Sputnik went up, and they had a dog in it, and he lasted about 9 hours, I understand. They didn't have enough oxygen. Yeah. So Jet Propulsion Laboratory, along with Werner von Braun, the German guy, they were disappointed that they hadn't been chosen to put the first U.S. satellite up, and they swore they would have easily beaten the Russians. I have a feeling that from a history standpoint, it's a good thing the Russians went first. Okay? That has a lot of effect of the unifying of the world. So that's the rocket that was used to put the first U.S. satellite up. So they strapped together 10 small rockets and made that the second stage, and using something equivalent to the V2. And then the top one up there became the satellite. And it was a rocket also. And when it finished, it stayed up there. And it tumbled. The experiment in there was actually constructed at NRL by our guys, because it was going to be an experiment in the big 20-inch sphere. And it turned out that somebody helped me. What's the Van Allen belt was discovered. So it had a cosmic ray detector in it. We had put it together at NRL. So Van Allen of Utah came and got that experiment and took it over to Huntsville, and they put it in this rocket. And so this is Werner von Braun, this is Van Allen, and this is, I'm going to call him Pritchard, but it's wrong. He was the head of Jet Propulsion Lab. Jet Propulsion Lab had been formed many years ago to study rocketry, the word jet propulsion. So that became, and they sort of my story has been corrected, but my story that I heard was we collected the data for them, and the thing was jammed. The voltage was at a maximum level and never changed. He says, "Oh my God, the thing failed." Well, a technician said, the story I heard was, came up to him and says, "You know, when I put the radioactive source too close, I get the same effect." He says, "Oh my God, the thing was saturated." And that was the discovery of the Van Allen belt. It was named after Van Allen here. So that's the first U.S. satellite. Subsequently, we finally got the 3 stages of the Vanguard put together, and the head of our group, and at my age I forget names, okay, but the head of our group was Irish, and we launched it on St. Patrick's Day. So help me, it succeeded. And so every St. Patrick's Day, the gang of us get on the phone to see who can call the other one and say happy birthday. So now Roger Easton was one of the key men in that. So I'm going to go forward with some of the, well, no, I want to go backwards. This guy here, Kevin is not here. I said, "You recognize this?" He said, "Yeah, that's a core memory." Any electronics guys in here? You ever seen a core memory? There you are, core memory on a plug-in.
That's
You're welcome to examine it.
yeah, you can touch it. I want to
Yeah.
come see RAM that you can actually see the individual zeros and ones.
So those are little tiny magnetic rings with wires going crisscross through it.
I mean, you won't be able to read them, but like you can see where each bit is. Each one of those little bumps is a bit.
So there's 32 bits in a row there.
The idea is you send voltage across two wires to polarize
Yeah.
the ring to turn in one direction.
It's like 9 across, I think. And,
Isn't it nice to see what memory used to be?
Were they still handmade?
there's one for correction.
This is what IBM came up with for the big memories.
Someone asked how much memory it was, and I just said, well, just count it.
Yeah, yeah.
And somebody counted them. There are 32 in a row.
The laser karaoke player that you picked up because like everyone knows.
If anyone else wants to come and see this and actually touch NASA,
Right.
I told you, as soon as they got a chance on it, they'll love it. So, yeah, I mean,
Oh my god.
try not to rub off all the sand, but otherwise, yeah, that's been in space.
You should know that
The white stuff, we painted it red to find it, and the white stuff is gypsum.
I think that might be a temperature sensor inside.
Yeah, we actually just opened.
Really came down hard, didn't it?
Oh yeah. Did it go head first or it smacked sideways?
Probably sideways, so you can see the bend where it hit, right there.
Yeah. I mean that's quite a bend.
The whole cone was an assembly.
That's the sort of RAM they had to stitch together by hand.
I have no idea.
As soon as
IBM
I'm a
was
kinesthetic
sure.
person,
We
so
built machines that do that. We had 1 million words of 64-bit memory made out of that stuff.
Yeah, that's big.
It was like a huge refrigerator. 1 million words.
Sounds like a lot. That was a lot.
That's 1970.
Yep. Yeah, for the Apollo missions, I think they had hand-stitched memory for each bit of the run. They would stitch it, and when they had to revise it, they had to take it apart and stitch it again, a different way, to change the
They had to do that with a machine.
Yeah, that's much later. But yeah, it's really cool.
Okay, everybody take a seat.
We had already gotten companies for
How long do I have?
this goes until for about another half hour,
Okay.
and then there's another.
We gotta
panel
go
here.
quick.
All right, so we got to move on.
This is turning out to be a monologue of.
Yeah. Do we want to get to OAO and TDRS?
Okay, well, before that, so I have here at the table two major, well, first of all, how do you track a satellite? And at the beginning, well, we built something called the mini-track system. We called it an interferometer. It really isn't, but it
We want to
uses
save
those.
some of the details of that for the panel at 6.
Okay,
So the technical stuff is going to come at 6, but
okay, that's good. All right, so I went through, a major member of the thing that builds the method that we use to track satellites. There's a whole story in that, okay? He says, you got to come back at 6 o'clock for that.
it gets technical. We talk megacycles and like width of radio waves and stuff about 10 feet across, and it's great.
Okay, so we went through the manned flight program. I participated in the launches of the Apollo and so forth. At one stage, I created a tracking method called Goddard range and range rate. So the interferometer method just measured the angles to a satellite as it moved very accurately. The ranging method was extremely efficient of electric power, of radio power. I just transmitted a tone, 100,000 cycle sine wave, to a satellite and back. And to make it very simple, I paint one of those sine waves red, and I watch the red one go out and get reflected back. It's echoed back. So I've measured the time of transit, and using the speed of light, I can figure out how far the satellite is. Okay, but that's now used universally for satellites, in particular deep space, because they need an extremely efficient. You can't have much power So you need a power-efficient method, and the tone ranging system is the best way.
It's also how we get cell phones to
Okay.
work.
So I'm going to explain that later, huh?
Yeah, at 6.
All right.
That's
So
the
these
technical panel.
documents speak to all the work that went into developing that method, and most of that came out of my head, okay, for that, how that system works. There's a particular way you paint it red, okay, the one wave. One last thing, one other thing. Guess what this is? This is a memory unit. It's a delay memory. There's a coil of coax cable in here, so you pump in the signal, and when it comes back, you return it, and it stays the same until you make changes, okay, to it. So that's one of the ways they fooled around with memory. Okay. The next phase is more important to me, and I'm wearing this hat. It says, yeah, we should show them that. The tracking and data relay satellite, okay? This is a satellite. It's actually a French satellite, Telecom 2. And I worked with the French for a period of time. So you can see a lot of people don't know what a satellite looks like, okay? These two dishes communicate to the Earth. This would be one that's going to broadcast television programs to you. So the programs are created on the ground. They go to the satellite that is the smallest because they use the higher frequency. And then it's amplified. And if I pull this apart, you can see some of the components inside and how they put that box together. And then this is retransmitted out. And these panels rotate always to stay shining at the sun. And this stays always looking down at the Earth. Okay, so you have to do that, and then the sun might be behind it. So these rotate to do that.
Talk about
So that's all right. The tracking. During the Apollo program, we had 25 ground stations, 3 ships, 6 airplanes, and we only saw them when they're orbiting the Earth 20% of the lifetime. So if anything went wrong, we'd never know what happened. Okay. So we worked under that method throughout the whole Apollo program. And then toward the end of the program, we said, we've got to do a better way. So I and another couple of guys came up with the idea of building this satellite and putting it in synchronous orbit at 22,000 miles. Does everybody understand synchronous orbit, that it effectively looks like it's standing still? So this is called the Tracking and Data Relay Satellite. It had operated at 2 different frequencies, one at around L band, which is 2,000 megahertz, and the other at KU band, which is 12 and 15,000 megahertz. This antenna is an umbrella. It's formed. It was done by Harris Corporation, which used to be called Radiation Systems in Florida. This is a better view of the antenna. It's 16 feet across. Think about that. It's about from there to there. And there's 2 of them for redundancy. So I had a competition in Goddard. The boss over me wanted to build a spinner. So there's a book over here that shows a spinning satellite. But this is called 3-axis stabilized. And Jet Propulsion is very good at 3-axis. All the satellites they ever put out were 3-axis stabilized, so that you can think. Both of them use the spin method. And the 3-axis stabilized, the spinning objects are inside, kind of a gyroscope of 3 different orientations. Okay. But the spinning is inside, not outside. So the JPL came up with this. I gave them a contract, and they came up with this design. And this is what we're flying today, 30 years later. Okay. It still hasn't changed. So these two antennas communicating with the ground station, which is in White Sands Proving
Here,
Ground.
hold it.
Huge one. And I didn't bring it. They have three gigantic 60-foot diameter antennas to communicate to this. This has these kind of antennas to communicate to the space station. And in its time, I decided on the highest data rate would be 300 megabits per second. That was unheard of. We were flying at that time 16 kilobits per second. Okay. So I was looking way ahead. And that's what, and right now they're adopted to 600 megabits per second. So 300 megabits per second could be handled by these big dishes. And it's a dual frequency, so the L-band is also available on this. The other the other requirement was to communicate to a bunch of small satellites. At that time, 1,000 kilobits per second was a good telemetry rate. So, so we needed, and there were many of them. So one of the requirements I made was we had to build something that would communicate to up to 30 simultaneously. So this is a phased array. And a phased array allows you to build multiple beams. And we build 30 pencil beams with this phased array. There are 30 little elements here. The problem back then was you couldn't fly the electronics. We didn't have miniature electronics at that time I was developing this. So I came up with a method of transmitting after the first detection, preamplifier, to transmit the back end of each of these elements to the ground. And the phase beams are formed on the ground. And again, Harris Corporation has that contract. So 10 racks of equipment, 3 boxes in each rack. Each one builds a Spenson beam. The neat thing about it is you could always change the software of what you're doing. And so I coined the name AGIPA, Adaptive Ground Implemented Phased Array. And it's caught on. So now that's one of those where you go to bed at night saying, how can I do this? How can I do this? And you wake up and all of a sudden there's an idea. How many of you have had that? See, so this is how it worked. So this is now called the Tracking and Data Relay Satellite. I retired from NASA in 1974 after 25 years total. I'd spent 1 year in the Navy in World War II at the end of it, and the rest all added up to 25, and it was an opportune time for me. So I went out of that and I got into the communication satellite business and spent the rest of my life all over the world buying satellites from Russia. I actually did. Okay, for 3 years we purchased their satellites. Then I later find, now and very recently I got a medal for creating this, that they've launched 13 of these. And
Modern ones, right?
And there was one period where they tried 3 of them where they would do the beam forming on board. And then they weren't happy with it. They went back to forming on board. No kidding. So this is 19, these ideas were born in 1958. So how long ago was that? Well, 42, 52, 60 years ago. Okay. Was this. And I actually made the prediction that 20 years from now, they'll still be learning how to do new things with it. And I was wrong. 60 years. And they now are looking at laser beams to communicate instead of those RF frequencies.
Oh, and
Okay?
that's what this comes
So-
out to. Your laser research.
Yeah, that's not me. That's,
Well,
yeah.
it's one of the ones you
But
had.
they are doing,
We're
NASA's
talking
doing
about
it.
Doing
NASA's doing
lasers
it.
now, and this is a book about laser space relay communication experiments from 1973. If you want to get the you want to catch it before it gets to HBO, right? So here's the book about what they're going to be doing in the next 10 years from 1973.
There's an entire building at Goddard called Building 12. I was, for a while, one of the managers of that. So it was one floor. The entire building now is TDRS satellite. And I've left out a whole lot because there was another group initially under me that had to build a transponder that goes in the user so that's compatible with the TDRS satellite. And that was a whole array of technology that had to be developed. So, and if you think about it, today there's a relay satellite on Mars. Can you think about it? With the thing down on the ground, they can't communicate directly back to the Earth because sometimes they don't even see the Earth. So there is a satellite like that JPL has built that they transmit the signal to, and the signal is transmitted back to the Earth. So data relay is the way to go, I guess.
So we have about 20 minutes left.
All right, a couple of things. This is a large dish. This is a 40-foot diameter antenna. It was a research one.
Yeah, let me hold that so you can get a microphone for the camera.
All right, hold it up. So this is, it's called ATS, Advanced Technology Satellite, number 6. It was built by Fairchild here in Washington.
Very interesting name, by the way.
Yeah.
Advanced technology. Who would have guessed? Really?
And that's a big one. On board that was the first experiment to prove that data relay would work. And the experiment was, again, in the Smithsonian, there was a display of an American satellite, Apollo, and a Russian one shaking hands in space. Does anyone remember that thing? It was the first time that the Russians and the Americans shook hands in space, and the relay experiment was built into this, proved we could do the data relay in satellite.
Do you want to mention OAO
So-
real quick?
Say it again.
And do you want to cover OAO real quick, that other picture?
Orbiting Astronomical Observatory.
Because everyone
You all-
loves Hubble. Everyone, I don't even have to ask that question.
You all know what the Hubble is, okay? No one talks about this one, okay? I was a chief engineer on this one. It's called OAO, Orbiting Astronomical Observatory. It has a 1-meter dish, and about 6 of them are flown. He's nodding
1
his
meter
head, yeah?
optics.
Yeah.
Whereas Hubble has 3
Hubble
meters,
is
right?
about 3 meters. It's a little, just a hair under. And look what it does. So no one gives credit. There was even a building just in one of the shopping centers today that with the technicians who helped out NASA called the building OAO. And the name OAO disappeared. And we attempted on this one to put a computer and a memory unit. IBM had the contract to develop both. And during the program, they just couldn't get the computer done in time. So we never flew the computer. But the work that we did was actually followed on in the first Apollo. Apollo carried 3 computers and as a redundancy system. And I think that it was formed by IBM and flew in there. So this is the first orbiting observatory. And I'd like to give it credit. I had left somewhat after they started launch. Actually, it was 1962 when we reviewed the first proposals, and Grumman got the contract to build that satellite. So there's OAO. And this is, as I said, one of the early communication satellites. Power was the big thing because if you're going to transmit TV, you have to have close to 200-watt transmitters in the satellite, and a bunch of them. Today there are 24 200-watt transmitters in some of them. And that one satellite transmits 160 channels by using compression methods. So with the old analog TV used up 6 megahertz of bandwidth, today they do it in about 1.5 megahertz of bandwidth by compressing and taking out redundancy. I say quickly for redundancy. The old TV would say gray, 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 gray 1,000 times. Gray. Well, it was simpler to say do gray 1,000 times and transmit that. That's compression. Okay. What else?
Well, do we want to give people a chance to look through some of these books, touch more of the stuff before the end of this panel, and come back at 6 for the more technical?
Oh, I think we'll review, huh?
Okay.
Anyway, how about some questions?
Do you know the story of, or can you tell the story of the first time they beamed the Apollo footage to the moon, to Australia, and then to the United States?
The first Apollo?
Or whichever one that they...
Well, there is one, yeah. When we were planning, another man whose name my buddy, we were planning the ground network system. And we said we had to have 85-foot diameter antennas. And Chris Kraft stopped us. He was in charge of spending money. He says, we're not going to put a camera on the first landing. And so we don't need this big antenna. So I changed the specification to saying that we needed to build a communication system that would operate in the worst of circumstances. And that would be a whip antenna and a 1-watt transmitter at the distance of the moon. Is that the story? Okay? Guess what? It took an 85-foot antenna on the ground to communicate to that. Okay? Well, Apollo 13, they had an accident, and they communicated with a whip antenna and a 1-watt transmitter and brought those men back. So that I like to tell that story. So, you know, as an engineer, you have to look forward and always think like that. So we later, Chris Kraft relented, and they did put a camera, but I understand it was designed so late, the only one they could get was a black and white. And that's why you saw, there went his name, 1 foot for man. Huh? Yeah. Neil. Yeah. So he would have loved to have had that color camera there. But and we had the opportunity to do it. So those are one little story, which I had an effect on, I think. My later life, one of the jobs I had was with a company called RimSat for the Pacific Rim. And a guy in Fort Wayne, Indiana, when the communist system died, the rule was that all of the workers in a manufacturing plant are now the owners of the plant, and they got to go out and sell. So way out in Siberia was a plant that built a communication satellite called Goront. And these guys in Fort Wayne, Indiana made a deal to put 6 of them in orbit for $140 million. That never completely did. So I was the chief engineer on that one. And so I spent 3 years buying satellite from Russia. And this is the launch of the first one. I've forgotten the name of the rocket, but it's the most popular rocket for the Russians using to put satellites up. Huh?
Proton rockets or zircon rockets?
I'm not here.
Proton or zircon rockets?
Yeah. Well, this is the popular one. It's not the one that puts man in orbit. Okay, it's the other one. So I've had a lot of visits to Russia. Visited the memorial for the first man in space and all of that. I've great life I've had. Okay. I worked until I was 80 years old. I was climbing dishes when I was in my 60s. So does everyone know why there's this big bloom of flame coming out. The temperature of the jet is over 2,000 degrees. Melts iron when it hits it. So at White Sands, as I remember, we dig a pit and we put some baffle plates that would deflect the flame outward. And then when it lights up, we push water onto the metal so it won't melt. And that's the steam coming out of there, of the hot plane. At Cape Canaveral, you can't dig more than 10 feet and you hit water. So there's no pit, and so everything is above ground. But I took that picture in Kazakhstan. Okay, time to quit.
Well, the next panel's at 4:45. We also need to pack some of this stuff up. And do we want to give people a chance to come and touch some more of the stuff, check it out?
Why don't you, yeah.
If you want to see some of the old training manuals from 1970, a sales pitch for Tidris,
Those are the manuals.
it's all up here.